Thank you, Bruce. And buenos dias a todos, bom dia a todos, and good morning, everyone. I'm Vinnie Nguyen, and as Bruce Vitor mentioned, I am Global Fishing Watch's U.S. Government Liaison Officer. Today, we have a wonderful day. Yesterday, we did the plenary day. A lot of theory, a lot of talk around IUUF, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. And today, we're going to have a training day, a workshop for you. Time to get into the data. Time to play around with Global Fishing Watch. Time to get in the ocean with us. We're going to start today with Tyler Clavelle and Gunther Errhalt. They're going to talk about Global Fishing Watch's big data and analysis. So how Tyler gets in there, wrangles the data, cleans it up, how he jumps into space, how he jumps into towers, and how he grabs all that data, cleans it up and tells a story. And how Gunther provides maritime applications for maritime security agencies around the world. Following that, we have Anna Sanders and Gisela Morenigo. They're going to be playing around with the bread and butter, the meat and potatoes, the public map and tools of Global Fishing Watch. They're going to show you both in English and Spanish of what the map's all about and all the tools and widgets that you can get in there that can help support IUUF operations and enforcement at sea for a more sustainable world. And finally, we've got a brand new report. It's a new analysis of the high seas squid fleet in Latin America, and it's going to be presented in Spanish, and that's how we're going to finish the day today. So let's start the day with Tyler and Gunther. Let me bring them on stage. Tyler is a data scientist with Global Fishing Watch. Tyler supports the development and use of Global Fishing Watch data by ensuring that our partners and the public have the tools and knowledge they need. He holds a bachelor's in biology and economics from Bucknell University and a master's from the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at the University of California, Santa Barbara, which happens to be a research partner of Global Fishing Watch. And prior to joining GFW, Tyler was a researcher with the Sustainable Fisheries Group at UC Santa Barbara, studying fisheries and aquaculture. Welcome to Tyler. And next to Tyler, co-presenting with Tyler, Gunther Errhalt. Gunther is a regional fisheries analyst for East Asia with us. He is responsible for working closely with regional fisheries management organizations, which we talked about yesterday. He works with coast guards and research institutions to research IUU activity, regional risk assessments, and coordinate fishery patrols with coast guards throughout the Pacific region. Additionally, Gunther is a U.S. Navy veteran and has a lot of RFMO experience, particularly with the North Pacific Fisheries Commission. He graduated from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies with a master's degree in international trade and economic diplomacy. With that, I'm going to bring Tyler and Gunther on stage to present today's first workshop topic, resources for the Global Maritime Security Community. With that, Tyler, Gunther, you've got the stage.
Great. Thanks, Vinny. I'm going to go ahead and get my presentation on screen. All right. So welcome, everyone. As Vinny mentioned, I'm Tyler Clavelle, data scientist with Global Fishing Watch, and my colleague Gunther Errhalt are going to talk to you today about Global Fishing Watch's big data research and analysis, resources for the global maritime security community. We're going to start with a quick outline. We're going to go over some of our data sources, then talk about the methods we use to convert those data sources to actionable data sets, and then how we apply those data sets in the maritime security domain. So jumping into some of our data sources, Global Fishing Watch fuses numerous data sources to detect, track, and identify vessels all over the world every day. We use vessel tracking systems that provide data on fine-scale vessel movements, which we use to identify various fishing activities. And then satellite imaging systems help us detect vessels, all vessels, above certain size and provide visual proof of activities. And we're going to get into these different types of data sets in more detail. So the core data set that Global Fishing Watch uses is the Automated Identification System, or AIS, which is a broadcast technology originally designed for ship-to-ship communication as a collision avoidance system. AIS messages transmit a lot of information about a vessel, including its identity, position, and speed, among others. And AIS messages are received by other ships and are picked up by both satellite and terrestrial receivers. So here's an example of what the global AIS data set looks like for vessels in 2018. And it is shown in hours of vessel presence per 100 kilometers squared. And you can really see clearly the world's shipping lanes, as well as some of the more diffuse fishing activity around the world's oceans that often stacks up against exclusive economic zones and coastal areas. But there are some key considerations to using and analyzing AIS data. AIS usage is increasing over time. More vessels are being required or self-adopting AIS devices. And most of the AIS data in the global data set is received by terrestrial receivers, meaning the vessels are within, close to shore. Each AIS device broadcasts in theory, unique ID known as the Maritime Mobile Service Identity, or MMSI. And AIS messages are kind of in two different forms. There's a position message that shows that broadcasts the vessel's actual location, and an identity message that says who that MMSI is, ship name, call sign. Importantly, identity messages do not include the location of the vessel, and this can complicate analysis, as we'll see in a minute. Furthermore, there are two main classes of AIS devices, Class A and Class B. Class A devices are stronger, ping more often, and are more expensive, which may explain why many fishing vessels we see in AIS are using Class B devices. In terms of fishing vessel coverage, we believe that we see roughly a small fraction of the world's estimated 3 million fishing vessels, around 70,000 active each year. But this coverage is much higher for large commercial vessels, and the vessels broadcasting AIS are predominantly from upper and upper middle income countries. The majority, 60% of fishing vessels in AIS are Chinese vessels, and a lot of these vessels are just operating within the Chinese EEZ. From a size perspective, we see almost no vessels broadcasting on AIS that are smaller than 12 meters. We see about a fifth of the vessels that are between 12 and 24 meters, and these are estimates. And we see more than half and an increasingly higher fraction of vessels over 24 meters. And these are the world's large commercial fishing vessels. So they're responsible for a disproportionate amount of catch. Another key consideration with AIS is reception quality. So not every AIS message that is broadcast is recorded. Again, it was originally designed for ship-to-ship communication. So in order for satellites to receive AIS messages, they must be overhead within range of the vessels. And similarly, terrestrial receivers can only receive messages in line of sight, so often limited to 50 or maybe 100 nautical miles from shore. And then AIS messages can interfere with each other, preventing receiver, mainly satellites, from recording them. So the way AIS messages get broadcast, if two vessels try to broadcast in the same time slot, a satellite is likely not going to receive either of those messages because they will interfere with one another. Finally, Class A, as I mentioned before, devices have stronger signals. And you can see this in these maps on the right, which show the estimated reception quality for Class A on top and Class B on the bottom. And these are the expected positions per day that you would receive from a vessel in different parts of the world. And this is predominantly driven by vessel density. You have a lot of vessels in these darker areas, and the signal interference problem is worse. So you can see there are, especially for Class B, there are considerable parts of the ocean where you may only expect to receive 10 or fewer, in some cases, positions from a vessel in a day, and that can really complicate your ability to investigate that vessel's behavior. Another challenge is what we call spoofing. So spoofing we refer to as two different types of activity where a vessel's location or identity is obscured in its AIS message. So identity spoofing is when two or more vessels simultaneously broadcast the same MMSI. Remember, I said in theory MMSI are unique, but in practice, many fishing vessels broadcast the same MMSI. And when you try to investigate the track of that data, you will see something that looks like the green track on my screen, where a vessel appears to bounce impossibly across the ocean. When you are able to separate that track, you can distinguish two individual tracks of two specific vessels. Similarly, location spoofing is when a vessel has altered its AIS positions in some way by adjusting lat long. And so this top figure, you can see the red track is the reported AIS movement of the vessel. And you can see as it leaves China and goes through Indonesia, it then suddenly drops to the Southern Ocean, and it makes an impossible movement over Antarctica before coming around South America. In reality, if you correct that track with a simple offset, you can see the vessel moving around the southern tip of Africa over to the west coast. So correcting or separating these spoofing behaviors often allow us to reveal suspicious activity. So in addition to AIS, Global Fishing Watch also uses vessel monitoring system data, so VMS data, which is a private tool for monitoring, control, and surveillance of fisheries activities by fisheries agencies. I'm sure we've talked a lot about VMS so far, and like AIS, VMS is a shipboard device using GPS to broadcast a vessel's location to satellite and terrestrial receivers. Unlike AIS, VMS messages often are broadcast at a fixed rate, and countries impose strict use requirements on VMS and hefty penalties for violations. So VMS data can complement AIS data in regions of poor AIS reception and just provide a more complete picture of activity in an area. So here's an example. This is the Global Fishing Watch map, and in here we only have AIS data visible. But if we add in VMS, in this case from Peru, Panama, and Chile, we get a much more complete picture of the area. And Global Fishing Watch, though not on the map yet, will be adding VMS data from several more countries, including Brazil, Ecuador, and Costa Rica. So now I'm going to shift over to the methods and how we use these vessel tracking data as well as satellite imagery data to derive actionable data sets. The data sets I'm going to go over are our fishing effort data set, so vessel-specific fishing activity, our vessel database, which is registry information for all vessels, a port visits and voyages data set, transshipment, and how we detect non-transmitting vessels using imagery data sets. So fishing effort, which is sort of the flagship Global Fishing Watch product, is the identification of apparent fishing activity in AIS and VMS data. We combine a comprehensive vessel database of vessel identity with two convolutional neural networks. So these are cutting-edge machine learning models that help us classify fishing vessels and then predict when they are fishing based on their movements. So the vessel classification model, this looks at all the AIS positions for a given MMSI and predicts the most likely vessel class for that MMSI. And it can be a fishing or non-fishing class. So it could be a trawler or it could be a cargo ship. Similarly, the fishing detection model looks at the AIS positions and predicts when in that track the vessel is fishing and when it's simply steaming. So this is an example of three types of fishing vessel movements that we see in Global Fishing Watch in the AIS data. And you can see these are quite distinct patterns. So the fishing classification model would look at a vessel's movements, and if it moved like the vessel on the left, it would call it a trawler. If it moved like the vessel on the right, it would label it a purseiner. Similarly, when a vessel is moving in certain patterns like we see here, it would label those positions as fishing positions. So these are the fishing classes, the fishing vessel classes that Global Fishing Watch uses to assign vessels. It is a nested hierarchy. So we may assign a vessel if we're very confident to a specific gear type, such as tuna purse seines. But if we're a little less confident that it's actually a tuna purse seine vessel, but we know it is a purse seine vessel, we would call it a purse seine. And not all categories are nested. So at the moment, we only have one trawler designation, but we do get asked sometimes about mid-water or bottom trawling. And that's one of the areas we're working to improve on, is expanding this classification. And then this is what a vessel's track may look like after it's been scored by our fishing model, where you can see it leaving shore and returning to port a couple times and then fishing while it's out. So the red portion of the track indicates when our model predicts that the vessel is fishing, and the blue parts are when it is steaming. So the combination of these two models, the identification of fishing vessels and the prediction of their fishing movements, combines to allow us to make maps like this, which show fishing by vessels with AIS. And this map is a cumulative map of the fishing activity between 2012 and 2020. And so you can see a lot of the kind of known hotspots of fishing around the world. So transshipment is our data set of potential at-sea transshipment events between fishing vessels and refrigerated carrier vessels. And we identify two types of events, and we use the AIS data for this. We identify encounter events when both a refrigerated carrier vessel and a fishing vessel are observed on AIS within 500 meters of each other and traveling less than 2 knots for at least 2 hours, with the idea being that those are an observed event of two vessels operating close enough where the transfer of crew or catch or supplies could occur. Similarly, loitering events are when we observe a carrier vessel operating in the same fashion, but do not necessarily see a fishing vessel alongside. And this is because many fishing vessels might not use AIS. And so seeing a carrier vessel behaving in the same way could indicate transshipment events with non-broadcasting vessels. And this is an example of one of the management tools that Global Fishing Watch has developed that shows, this is our carrier vessel portal, and it shows the number of potential transshipment events occurring throughout the ocean. And you can dig into different regions, and here you can see the number of events broken down by the carrier vessel themselves, as well as whether or not Global Fishing Watch believes those events were authorized. And we combine our registry, our vessel database that has authorization information to make these judgments. Moving on to our ports data set, Global Fishing Watch has developed a global data set of over 166,000 anchorage points that are grouped into ports. And we track visits by vessels to these ports using this data set. We identified anchorages using the AIS data and gridding the world into half-kilometer cells. We then looked in the entire history of the AIS data for when multiple vessels remain stationary in a given cell for periods of time, indicating that they're likely anchored in those areas or at port. We then look at certain what we call port events. So when vessels enter a port, when they actually stop at a port, when there's a gap, if they turn their AIS off at port, using several rule-based algorithms. So on the right here, you can see just a quick map of some of the anchorage locations we have off the coast of Brazil. And then this is a demonstration of how the port visits algorithm works. So you can see a vessel track approaching the port of, I believe, Abidjan. When it gets within range of an anchorage at that port, you see the green dot, at which point Global Fishing Watch has recorded a port entry to the port of Abidjan for this vessel. It then proceeds closer into port and actually stops and slows down. And that's where the yellow dot is, and that would indicate a beginning of a port stop. The vessel doesn't stay long in this case and leaves. So maybe it dropped off a crew member, maybe it picked up some supplies. And when it speeds up, above a certain threshold, that marks the end of the port stop, indicated by the purple dot. And then the vessel leaves the port and heads back out in the similar direction. And once it is past a certain threshold of an anchorage at the port, we mark down a port exit. And collectively, these 4 events make up one port visit by that vessel. As I've mentioned a few times, we have a vessel registry database, and this is a comprehensive data set of information sourced from public vessel registries and supplemented with AIS data. And this data set summarizes things like vessel identity, so the ship name, call sign, IMO number, listed on multiple vessel registries, characteristics of the vessel, its length, engine power, tonnage, crew size, authorizations, is it authorized to operate or fish in certain RFMOs, and potential ownership of the vessel. And then these identities from the registries are matched against the identities we see in AIS data to match up the vessel and summarize its AIS activity as well. So we can then use this vessel registry database for many things, one of which I mentioned earlier with tracking authorizations of potential transshipment events. And here's another example that combines our port data set I just mentioned with this vessel registry. And this is a in development piece of research. And you can see these are the top 50 ports where we believe we see vessels reflagging. So we can look at when the vessel reflags in our database and then actually look at the location of that vessel at the time and track which ports it's reflagging. And in this plot is actually showing whether it's reflagging to a national flag of the port it's at or whether it's foreign to foreign flagging. Lastly, our dark target data set is vessel detections that are derived from global satellite imagery rather than vessel tracking data sets. And we use various machine learning models to detect vessels in these sets of imagery. We use synthetic aperture radar, so SAR. We also use the visible infrared imaging radiometer suite, which is a bit of a mouthful, but most people would know about it as night lights. And then optical imagery, true color images. And when possible, we can then match these individual vessel detections to AIS data to determine vessel identity, as well as quantify the dark fleet, the non-broadcasting vessels that we can't see on AIS. And that is done using some little bit of math where if you imagine you have a single point in time with a vessel detection from imagery, and you may have AIS data that is near to that detection, but never exactly in the same location. And so we do some math to figure out the most probable AIS position associated with that vessel detection. And if it's beyond a certain threshold, then we just assume the vessel is not broadcasting on AIS. And over on the right, you can see a couple examples. On top is detections from radar, vessel detections from radar. So you can see shipping lanes and then more diffuse activity. And then below is our vessel detection from Sentinel imagery, where you're getting individual vessels detected. So Global Fishing Watch tries to make as much of our code and data sets available. And this is a to the public. And this is a quick snapshot of our data download portal, where you can go online and click through various data sets and download, anyone can go download these data sets, including data associated with publications such as our initial transshipment report. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and just talk about our research program at Global Fishing Watch. And this is where we come up with the ideas or the prototypes for a lot of the data sets I just mentioned. They often start as just brainstorming sessions with researchers where we think about what could we learn from the AIS data or from these satellite imagery data sets. And then we build the initial algorithms to do these different data sets. We then translate those prototypes into research projects to publish the methods and the data sets themselves in peer-reviewed journals. Lastly, we take the results of those publications and those models and convert them into management tools, such as the carrier vessel portal and our fishing map that I'm sure you'll hear more about today. So before I pass it off to my colleague Gunther, just a case study of how we use these different data sets in that process is a recent paper on illuminating dark fishing fleets in North Korea. So in about mid-2018, Global Fishing Watch was alerted by South Korean authorities of suspicious activity by Chinese vessels appearing to enter the North Korean EEZ. When intercepted fishing vessels spoke to South Korean authorities, they claimed they weren't fishing and said there was no proof of their activities. And when we looked in the AIS data, we didn't see really any activity in the North Korean EEZ. So what we did is developed a handful of machine learning models to detect vessels in multiple satellite imagery data sets, and then match these detections to AIS, as I described before. And this allowed us to show that a large fleet of Chinese vessels, pair trawling vessels, and large light illuminating squid vessels were in fact operating in North Korean waters, and this was in violation of UN sanctions and Chinese domestic law. And these findings were published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal and received extensive media coverage. So on the right figure just summarizes some of what those results were, that we saw between almost 600 and 800 pair trawling vessels, as well as over 100 large Chinese lighting vessels operating in the area. And a side finding to this was that the presence of the large fleet was displacing smaller artisanal North Korean squid vessels that were making a longer perilous journey to the Russian EEZ. And what was happening is many vessels were being lost at sea and washing up on Japanese shores, and they were being called ghost boats, and they weren't really sure what was causing that. And this study showed that this was in large part due to this behavior. So this is just some examples of the outputs of the models and the data sets from the vessel detection. So on the left is top left is the output of our one of our optical imagery models that detects individual groups of pair trawlers. Below that is Sentinel radar detections and the red dots of individual vessels. The nightlight imagery showing clearly large bright vessels operating in the area. And then lastly, the high resolution optical imagery was able to detect individual lighting vessels in the area. So now I'm going to pass it over to Gunther, who's going to walk through some of the applications of these data sets.
Thanks, Tyler, and hello, everybody. I'm Gunther Errhalt, as Vinnie mentioned. I'm a U.S. Navy veteran and fisheries analyst within Global Fishing Watch. And today I'm going to be talking about the analysis program and how we take some of the algorithms and tools made by Tyler's research team and produce actionable products out of them. So we have numerous types of reports that we can create, such as vessels of interest analysis, dark target analysis with VIIRS, SAR, and optical, IU fleet analysis, other things such as transshipment operations, coastal state and port risk, flag state vessel monitoring, as well as patrol support, strategic, operational, tactical, and then we can also assist in analyst training within our partner organizations. So the first one I want to talk about here is a vessel of interest analysis that we did in collaboration with some of our partners. So there was a vessel, the Huyen Yulong 999, which was found to have shark fins on board while operating in the Galapagos EEZ. Using our encounter algorithm, we found that that vessel with the shark fins had made a possible encounter with the MV Nika. In collaboration with Indonesia and Panama and Interpol, we were able to track this vessel and eventually lead to this vessel being investigated by the Indonesians, which led to a confiscation of the ship, the arrest of 20 of its crew members, jail time for the vessel operators, and ultimately a $6 million fine. Next slide. Here you're going to see a quote by Ahmed Santosa of Indonesia from Task Force 115, and I'll let you read his quote here. Okay. So now I want to talk about how we use some of that dark target analysis like we did in that North Korean paper on some more specific little cases. In this case, we were provided information from the US Coast Guard on this unclassified vessel, the Mario 11 and the Mario 7, which were two unknown vessels not broadcasting AIS operating outside the Bermudan EEZ, which the US Coast Guard believed to be engaging in some sort of mini reefer operation or other type of IUU fishing operations. However, they were unable to track it due to having no AIS. However, by looking at the AIS in the given area, we were able to find that the Mario 11 and the Mario 7 had AIS on their buoys and on their fishing gears. By finding all of their fishing gears in our data set, we were able to make a historic track of these vessels dating back all the way to January 2018. By using this, we were able to identify that this vessel operated out of the ports of Dakar, Senegal, and Port of Spain, Trinidad. We were also able to find all of the historic areas in which this vessel operated at each given time, so that in the future, we can lead to a possible capture or identification of this vessel. If a vessel is working with us in a patrol, and this vessel we know operates around the same area as its patrol, we can then point out the Mario 11 operates usually this many clicks away from your given location around this time, so you may be able to encounter that vessel now. Next slide. Tyler, next slide. Yeah, so then again, in a larger sense, with the dark fleet, we found a large dark fleet operating out of Iran that was operating within the EEZs of Oman, Yemen, and Somalia. We found around 175 Iranian vessels in these waters. Similarly to the Mario case and in the North Korean case, we were able to match the gears to vessels and invent these tracks leading back to Iran, eventually finding these 175 vessels being one of the largest IU fleets operating in the ocean currently that we know of. Next, we have the Squid Fleet report. You're going to be hearing a little bit about this more later on from Ais, but we're currently engaging in a report on squid activities across the globe. And here in this image, you can see from VIIR's data, we can identify different time periods of different fleet activity, squid fleet activity around Peru and the Galapagos Islands. In the yellow, you can see January and March, and red, you can see right outside of the Galapagos EEZ, a lot of activity happening in that time. Oh. Yeah. So, okay, next slide. And we also engage in fisheries patrol support. Most of the patrol support that we've been engaged in is with the US Coast Guard. However, we are open to doing patrols with other countries such as Ghana. In August of 2020, alongside UNODC and TMT, we supported the Ghana Navy in a fisheries patrol using SAR, AIS, and creating a pre-patrol analysis, which I will highlight a little bit later on. And we also engaged in live target identification throughout this patrol. With the help of UNODC, TMT, and our data sets, Ghana was able to arrest 5 ships and caution an additional 4. This is a big mission of Global Fishing Watch to help these types of countries who are maybe lacking in certain data sets or so on, and maybe don't have the patrol capacity currently to do these sorts of patrols without greater support from UNODC, TMT, and ourselves. So this was a great success for both Ghana and ourselves. Next slide. And now I want to talk about some of the greater patrol support that we've been doing, especially in regards to the U.S. Coast Guard. So our support for fisheries patrol started in 2019 with Captain Adam B. Morrison, who was the U.S. Coast Guard liaison to Japan, who I met while I worked at the NPFC. Together, we decided to try and engage in a collaborative effort between Global Fishing Watch and the U.S. Coast Guard to see if we can improve or find more violations in the North Pacific. Can you next a little bit? So what we were able to do is find this cyan area up here where we believe there was more IUU fishing going on based on the groupings of different vessels in those areas, based on the types of encounters, the amount of vessels which did not have proper authorization from the NPFC Secretariat, and other activities of interest going on in these areas. The red area was the original area where the patrol was planning on going, and then the blue area is where we ended up recommending. However, it's hard to know exactly where operations may have happened. Can you next a little bit, Tyler? So another part that comes up, yeah. So this ended up increasing the vessel. Go back, Tyler. There was a 344% increase in vessel boardings and an 876% increase in identified vessel violations compared to 2018 in this patrol, which is in collaboration between us and the U.S. Coast Guard and everything. And here is a quote from Captain Morrison about the success of that 2019 patrol. I'll let you read for a second. Okay, next slide, Tyler. So next, I want to talk about Operation Southern Cross, which may be of more interest to the current audience that we have here today. So this is the most recent large-scale patrol that Global Fishing Watch has engaged in with the U.S. Coast Guard. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of how we do these sorts of patrols and support the Coast Guard in these actions with our data sets. Next time. But before I do so, I want to mention this. This is part of the research team's work. There is a labor risk model that was made in collaboration with University of Santa Barbara, California, Santa Barbara, where we took known labor violators and matched them with other vessels based on certain indicators such as time at sea, distance from ports or other vessels, hours of fishing a day, and risky port usage. By doing so, we were able to kind of create a score to say how much the movements and behavior of one vessel mimics that of a known IUU or risk abusing vessel. Next slide. So next a little bit. So what we do first is we get this general patrol area for the patrol that will be going on. From, in this case, it was from Trinidad down to Argentina. We create a little bit of a buffer around the EEZs to see whether activity may be happening right outside the patrol zone to maybe further expand the idea of where the patrol may garner more interesting results. Next. Within this area, we'll pull all of the fishing activity that occurred during the time period that this patrol will be going on. So let's say it's January to February, we pull all of the fishing activity from January to February within this area. And we create a heat map with the risk of labor abuse being the how it's weighted. We can see here in the most northern part, right above, I think it's Fernando Island of the Brazilian EEZ, there's a lot of fishing activity with a high labor risk score. And then further down near, right outside the Brazilian EEZ in the middle, and then of course down in mile 201 outside of Argentina. Next. After that, we take the encounters and loitering events as just previously explained by Tyler that also happened during the period that the patrol will be happening, historically speaking. So we can know historically where these events may take place during these times. So in this situation, you can see the cyan dots are the encounter events and the loitering events are in red. As Tyler mentioned, the loitering events can be indicative of possible dark fleet activity, as we can see one vessel operating in a way where we would assume it's having an encounter, but we can't see any other types of vessels in the area. Next. After which we can create these areas of interest where we can kind of capture the most of those loitering events, encounters, and risky fishing events in each of these AOIs or along the patrol path in this case. Next slide. Then we can zoom in. In this case, we're zooming in on AOI 5, which happens to be right outside the Brazilian EEZ. Brazil here is in the top left. In the middle is the Brazilian EEZ. And on the outside is outside of the Brazilian EEZ in the Atlantic, South Atlantic. So we create these grids. And within these grids, we sum all of the activity based on the labor risk score to kind of create a density of vessels within that grid. And then in the center of these grids, you can see a separate number. This number is the average score of all the vessels in that area. So in this example, you can see there's these cyan dots, which are the transshipments, are mostly along the Brazilian coast. And you can see 4 yellow squares within the Brazilian EEZ. That means there's a lot of vessels operating in that area. But if you look at the number in the center, it's only 0.46 or 0.31, with 1 being the highest number on the scale. That means that, yes, there's a lot of vessels operating in these squares, but the likelihood that they're engaging in some form of possible IU, fishing activity, or labor risk is a bit diminished, it's a bit smaller. However, you look right outside the Brazilian EEZ, there's 5 other yellow squares, which have the same amount of density as the ones within the EEZ, but the average score is 0.73, 0.74, and so on. This is a lot higher. So in this situation, if a vessel was in patrol within AOI 5, we would recommend looking in these 5 grids right outside the Brazilian EEZ, as you're more likely to run into a vessel in these areas, and the vessel that you run into is, according to the algorithm, more likely to be engaging in some sort of activity of interest. Next. Then within these AOIs, we also will provide a list of the vessels of greater interest based on the risk score. In this situation, the vessels that are operating right outside of the EEZ seem to be mostly Taiwanese drifting long lines. As you can see, the first one is the Yuan number 106, the score of 0.75, higher on the scale. And then after that, you can see the Yuan 236 and so on. As you can see, the first 6 or so are all Taiwanese drifting long lines. There may be other vessels which maybe historically have not operated in this area, and it may be their first year operating in the area. And they may also be Taiwanese drifting long lines. This may indicate to the patrol vessel that if they see a Taiwanese drifting long line versus maybe a Brazilian drifting long line, it may be more likely, you may be more likely to find something of interest within the Taiwanese drifting long line vessels compared to the Brazilian ones operating here, based on the scores of all the other Taiwanese vessels operating in the area. Next slide. So this actually ended up working exactly as planned, where we recommended number 1, the Yuan 106, and they ended up running into the Yuan 106 and the Yuan 102 while operating around this area. what they were able to discover was that these vessels had shark fin on board, and were also throwing bodies of sharks off the ship. And they were able to take these photos of the vessels while they were in operation. So this was a great success, been able to discover these two vessels based on the labor risk model identification system within these grids and kind of directing them in the area where we believe these vessels may be operating. So we also were able to afterwards use our data set, which has some of the company information, ownership information, to discover that the Yuanmao 102 was owned by Dingmao, and the Yuanmao 106 was owned by Yunmao Ocean Enterprise. By utilizing our international and multilingual analyst base, I myself speak Mandarin and Japanese, we're able to use public information from the internet to discover that the Dingmao and the Yunmao Ocean Enterprise, despite being two separate companies, are actually owned by the same individual. So that we can kind of assess that maybe all vessels within this greater network owned by this individual may also engage in similar sorts of behavior. And we can keep that in mind for future analyses in the area. Next slide. Next slide, Tyler. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about future analyses and tools that we plan on making. So this entire grid or geospacing idea that we're utilizing in patrols, we hope to create a patrol planning tool so that other countries can do this on their own. Logging into the tool, uploading your own shape files, getting all the information, and helping kind of create some resource allocation. So if you want to create a patrol in the Pacific in July, you can direct your resources to a specific location, which is possibly seen as a more high-risk IUU area for fisheries. Or if you only have one patrol vessel and you're in whatever country, and you want to look at every individual month to see which month within your EEZ supposedly has the highest risk, you'll be able to do that with the tool without having to rely on other analysis to kind of produce these for you. You can do it on your own utilizing this tool. And this will be very helpful for a lot of countries who maybe don't have the means to do that or don't have the analysis groups capable of doing this right now. So that's one tool that we hope to do. For example, you can look in the bottom left where you see Northern Mariana Islands and Guam. If you were interested in doing a patrol at, I think this is January, you can see that just south of Guam or in the upper corner, there's a higher density of vessels operating in the area. So that may lead you to want to do it in that time, or you can look at other months to see which month may be the most effective and you'll get the most out of doing a patrol during that time. Lastly, there's going to be a couple other tools that will be talked about next from Anna and Gisela on port states and marine protected areas. Next slide. And yeah, thank you. I hope everyone had a good time, and I look forward to any questions from Tyler, for Tyler and I. Thank you.
Tyler, Gunther,
Yeah.
thank you very much for that presentation. So everyone, as you can see, the data can be cleaned and filtered, and it can have many applications. You can do open source intelligence, as Gunther alluded to drive a lot of your operations and answer a lot of your policy questions with regard to IUUF. Also, I want to give a shout out to Paul Woods, who's on the line. A lot of folks are probably in the audience seeing that Paul Woods is answering a lot of your questions. And Paul Woods, if you weren't here yesterday or you're not familiar with Paul Woods, he's Global Fishing Watch's Chief Innovation Officer and co-founder. And so he's been diligently answering your questions in the Q&A. And so thanks to him. So Tyler and Gunther, we've got some great questions from the audience. We've got a question regarding AIS. We've got another question about spoofing, and we've got lots of questions here. So we've got a question by David Pearl. He asks, Why would a vessel operator spoof its location so that it jumps to an impossible location when they could just simply turn off their AIS? How do you know if a vessel operator is doing the location manipulation and not a data processing error inherent in the mass collection of AIS data? Looks like, Tyler, you got an answer for that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think we have a way, unless we were to speak to one of the captains, I don't think we have a way to know for sure if they're choosing to manipulate it in cases, or if there's maybe a default in the device. So sometimes we see this location offset happen when they cross the equator. And so there are certain patterns that may suggest that there are problems with certain devices. But we also see this type of behavior in situations where the vessels where they actually go are not locations they should be going, which suggests that it may be in fact kind of a default or a chosen behavior. Now, why they would choose to do that over turning the AIS off, I'm not sure. Potentially, so if their AIS is on, they remain. If they're traveling with other vessels, or if there are other reasons they might want to keep it on. But yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. There have been times on boardings that I've been on in the past whereby the VMS boxes just need to be reset. And some of the tools on board the vessels are old, or the boxes need to be renewed and what have you. So, but what we can do is we can try to do an investigation with all the data and see if it was indeed user error, machine error, the receiver's errors, or if it was indeed maybe because of the crew, maybe because of the captain. But that's why you have to validate the data, and you got to keep digging deep on the data. So, Paul, you appeared on the video there. Do you want to say anything about that on the spoofing item? I know we've got you work with one of our analysts, Bjorn, a lot on the spoofing. He's a spoofing geek, I like to call him, because he just digs deep in the spoof data. But do you have any thoughts on that, Paul?
Yeah, that's been kind of a pet project for me, understanding the spoofing behavior. And I think that, so one of the things that we know is that groups of vessels will conduct this offsetting behavior together with the same offset. And this causes a group of fishing vessels to all appear in a false location, but they're in the correct place relative to each other. And we believe this behavior is about avoiding competitors. So they're still using AIS so they can keep track of where their colleagues are, where the other fishing vessels that they're collaborating with are. So when they're on the radio talking to those vessels, they can see on their nav screen where they are relative to the boat. But the competitors don't see them on their nav screens at all in the true location, because they're offset by 1,000 miles. So we suspect that is the reason for that kind of behavior. But I'll say there are lots of things that cause false locations. So we lump it all together. We just detect a broadcast location that is not in the reception footprint of the satellite it was received by. And so vessels that do that consistently are broadcasting false locations. There are lots of reasons why they might do that, including deliberate interference by third parties in their GPS reception. So there are lots of reasons, and completely false tracks of vessels that don't exist or are not at sea at all, like we've seen recently with some NATO vessels in the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. So there are lots of reasons this would happen. We focus mostly on the fishing vessels that we think are doing it deliberately, and also where they're using a constant offset that can be corrected, so we can actually determine the true location if we do a little bit of work.
Thanks, Paul. You were lockstep with Jean-Pierre Roja. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your last name, Roja. Paul, at the bottom of the Q&A, he was like, if they want to use their AIS to detect other vessels, do they have to also be broadcasting? So that would be a reason to do the offset. And then he answers himself, and he said, you just answered, smiley face. So you were reading the audience quite well, Paul. All right, let's move on to another question. Not that I don't like talking about spoofing, but there's lots of other questions here in the Q&A. I believe we've got a gentleman in attendance from Singapore. We've been working a lot with the Information Fusion Center, and correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, but he asks, AIS's implementation by IMO for maritime safety, and it's still not requested by all vessels to set up. So how do we request all fishing vessels to have AIS? I know each country is different with regard to AIS requirements on large vessels and on fishing vessels. So does that request need to be done by the IMO, the FAO, or RFMOs? And to boot, Gunther, coastal AIS signal receive stations have limited distance. And then some countries have no budget to put satellites up or even access to data, right? I think that's the value proposition that Global Fishing Watch has given, right? Is that we're providing that through our products and services free to the world. So he asks the larger question, how do we build a more fair world with regard to all those variables? Tyler, Gunther, Paul, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging question. There's I think a lot of factors there. As I mentioned before, Ais devices can be quite expensive, especially the Class A devices, and so figuring out who's going to pay for that device. Is it fair to ask the fishers to cover that? Should the government and the management bodies help subsidize that? And depending on vessel size, is it appropriate to reveal positions for all vessels in some cases? And then there's also the challenge of, as you mentioned, the terrestrial receivers. If there's not a good terrestrial network, and you're in areas of satellite saturation problems, adding devices to these vessels may not do much because you're only going to get a few positions. And so there's a lot of planning that should go into it and thoughts, but specifically how to approach requiring AIS on fishing vessels is it's a complicated question. Paul, do you have any thoughts that you want to add there?
Yeah, I would just add that we have a policy position at Global Fishing Watch that AIS should be mandatory for all vessels that are licensed to fish in the high seas and all vessels that are fishing in the waters of other nations. And this should be a requirement tied to IMO registration. And so that, of course, that's a hard thing to get done, but that's the policy that we advocate in international bodies whenever we have the opportunity.
Thanks, Paul. So I do notice on our Q&A, there's a lot of folks asking, will this video recording be presented in the language of choice or the original audio? I want to tell you again that the video recording will be presented along with a summary sheet of everything that's been talked about, the questions and answered, everything in a clean, concise way in a PDF and Word document, as well as this video. FIU, along with Global Fishing Watch, are going to work to send that out to you. I think it's also going to be posted to FIU's Jack Gordon Institute for Public Policy's YouTube channel as well. So I just want to let everyone know that. There were several questions on the Q&A regarding if this video will be presented and shipped off to folks who were in attendance. And yes, it will. Let's go off to some more simpler questions. There's one from Manuel. I think this is probably easily answered by Tyler and Gunther. Is it possible for a fishing boat to continue to send a signal with the previous flag code when it changes the flag? Or is this information updated as fast as said flag change is made?
So yes, the AIS messages, the flag is derived actually from the MMSI, the mid code or the first 3 digits, and is not, as I understand it, necessarily the registered flag of the vessel. I think usually they will switch. A lot of times you will see them switch MMSI when they've reflagged, but I don't think that's necessarily always the case. And so the reflagging we see, we're actually looking into this in more detail now, which was what that figure I showed is part of an analysis where lining up the MMSI of the vessel with its registered information and seeing when it's registered as under a different flag state and matching that to its AIS activity. And in a lot of cases, you'll see it switch MMSIs over at the same time, and other times you don't. But there's not a separate flag field broadcast by the identity messages.
Yeah, and just to add to that a bit, there's an issue where sometimes these vessels, when they do change their MMSI or they change their flag, they do it incorrectly. And you see this a lot in the South China Sea and so on, where we see a lot of vessels broadcasting as Albanian, because the Albanian flag is the first one that comes up when you put in MMSI. So whoever the captain is just selected the first couple of numbers, and you see a bunch of Albanian vessels in the Pacific, which are most likely, according to their vessel tracks and so on, actually Chinese flagged or from China at the very least, but are showing as Albanian.
Thanks,
Yeah, I'll just
Gunther.
add that we do, like Gunther alluded to, there are also a lot of invalid MMSIs that are used. And so we periodically review the activity of vessels with invalid MMSI or just across flag states to see where unusual things are happening, like the Albania case, and where we can kind of infer that those are probably not actually Albanian vessels.
Thanks, Tyler. Thanks, Gunther. That was a good question. It caused a lot of feedback with regards to flag and data delay. And yeah, that's, at the end of the day, the data analyst and the data scientists have to deal with a lot, because junk in, junk out. And I'll tell you what, there is a lot of junk data out there when you have lots of hands in the pot that are putting data in. So thank goodness for guys like Tyler at Global Fishing Watch and the other data scientists that can just go in there. I'm gonna ask one more kind of a data tech question, and it's gonna geared at Tyler, and then we'll shift it a little bit more to enforcement items with what we're gonna do with the data to actually do something to support counter IUUF. And so, and this is from Tom in Canada. He asks, the sample data sets provided by GFW for download have a Unix timestamp instead of more common date and time or date time fields. Can GFW provide the date with the more common date and time or date time fields, please? It looks like Paul's like, oh my goodness, I can't believe they asked such a deep data question. Paul or Tyler, what are your thoughts on that? Can we do that? Or is that something we can do?
So yeah, the daily fishing effort data, I believe is just has a date column. I wasn't aware if there's a I should not have a timestamp to it. The training data that we provide, which is raw vessel tracks, may have a timestamp field. I may be misunderstanding the question. Paul, do you?
No,
What?
the simple answer is yes. That's excellent feedback. We'll do something about it.
Thanks, Paul. And what we'll do is Tyler can stay on and jump in on the question, Tom, and then just do a private answer to you, and then you guys can go back and forth regarding what your thoughts are on that. Moving over to Tim. Tim says, fantastic, thanks for the answers. Now he's wondering, he's asking, hey, look, we've got all this data. You guys are providing, are doing a phenomenal job with the data, but at the end of the day, what are we doing with these findings and the evidence? What are we doing with the research and the patrol planning when IUU is happening in international waters? Is there any way to prosecute?
Yeah, I'll answer that. Global Fishing Watch's stance is not really to publicly name and shame the vessels that we investigate and we have these analyses for. We produce these and we give these to the governments, the government that is investigating said vessel. And then if we have a working relationship and it's agreed upon, we can also share with that flag state of the vessel being investigated to get their comments and so on. Naming and shaming isn't really our game. And we hope, like in the example of the Mario 11, right? These vessels were operating out of Dakar. We were able to talk to the people in Dakar through some of our partners, and they let us know that the vessel was then deflagged. So this is usually how we operate in terms of kind of holding these vessels accountable. And if we're helping the US Coast Guard in a patrol and they end up engaging with the vessel and they find violations, they have all the means to then prosecute. It's not in our hands. We just help point in the right direction. Yeah, I don't know if Paul, you want to comment more on that? Or...
I would just add that it helps that the data that supports the IUU assessment is public, and therefore the participants who should be doing something about it know that other people also know, because if you know where to look in the Global Fishing Watch map, right, you can see it. So you can approach it two different ways. If you have a partner that is willing to listen to you, then you can bring it to them quietly. And if you have a partner that's not interested, then you can give it to another NGO who likes shouting at governments, and they can do what they do.
Yeah, good point. We got a question from Katie Moore. I've talked to Paul about this. We've talked about this at Global Fishing Watch a lot, actually. Is there a fear that people will use Global Fishing Watch to do more bad stuff? So her question is there concern that use of AIS for these analyses purposes or their analysis purposes may contribute to mariners using AIS lists frequently or other signals? Tyler, Gunther, Paul, any thoughts on that?
I'll comment, and I think Tyler can elaborate more on it. But we do see a lot of vessels who turn off their AIS, maybe when they're engaging in something suspicious, right? But Tyler is currently working on ways of identifying when we believe these vessels are purposely turning off their AIS. So even if they purposely are turning off their AIS when it's mandatory by certain standards, we can still kind of investigate those behaviors with different models and investigations. So, I mean, Tyler could probably explain a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, Gunther really hit the nail on the head there. That one of the prototypes we're working on right now is a smart way to identify actual AIS disabling. As you can imagine, there are a lot of reasons why you don't see AIS signals for long periods of time due to reception quality and other reasons. But we're working on ways to kind of separate that out from actual disabling. So when you should expect to see many positions from a vessel and you suddenly don't. And so I think the idea is if vessels do start changing behavior in response to things like Global Fishing Watch, we think we can maybe stay out front to just at least point out that they're intentionally not using the system as frequently as they are. And just, our goal is to provide the data objectively, and as Paul said, different partners or users can then interpret that data in the way that is appropriate to the setting.
Yeah, if I can just add, when we launched the platform in 2016, that concern was raised, and we've sort of been tracking it on a global scale ever since. And we've not seen a dramatic decline in AIS use particularly amongst fishing vessels. We've seen an increase overall that comes from increased mandates to use AIS. But we have not seen a large-scale shift in behavior as a result of this information being more public than it already was, right? And that speaks to the fact that I think that the bad operators knew all along the authorities were using AIS to track them, and so the ones that really don't want to be tracked know they can turn it off, and the ones for whom the safety of value is greater than the risk that somebody might track them, right, they use it.
Yeah, no, good point, Paul. We've got our colleague Greg Saad from Exelon who makes a great point. Prosecutions linked to the flag state when on the high seas. U.S. Coast Guard isn't necessarily able to hold non-U.S. flag vessels accountable wherever they find a vessel. They can only present the evidence package to that country or RFMO and say, do what you can. Good point, Greg. I also want to point out that in the Q&A, they mentioned two things with regard to training programs. One was a training program on how to use the map. And even deeper, our colleague Tom from Canada has asked for a fishing vessel track analysis training curriculum. Tom, we are doing that. Gunther and I are doing that. We've heard the masses. They've asked for such things, and we are planning on making a curriculum of such sorts. And when we do, we will notify folks out there. Kayla, hello, Kayla. I see you have a question in the Q&A, and it'll probably be our last one. And we're about to time up, but one last question. Many vessels use flags of convenience. How are you able to determine the correct flag state, especially since AIS can be manipulated? Everyone loves flags of convenience. You can hopefully make more money as a business. Any thoughts on that for Kayla?
Yeah, that's where combining our registry database with the AIS data, I think comes in, is we can compare what a vessel is flag is registered as to what MMSI they're using, and see when they're, those are not aligned, and beyond that, I think it's a little more tricky, but that's, I think, how we approach the situation is looking at what they're broadcasting on AIS, and then if they are registered, and we have that information, what does that information tell us?
Great.
Yep. And I should mention also, we are collaborating with the government of Panama. They are sharing their VMS data with us. And one of the things we are doing with them is analyzing the VMS data, looking at AIS broadcasting vessels that claim to be Panama flagged, and bringing that to the Panamanians so they can take action. And we've had a few cases successfully dealt with.
Good points, Paul. Well, Gunther, Tyler, thank you for your time. Tyler is over in New England area. Gunther is all the way in Japan. Thank you for your time today.